Good afternoon, everyone, again. Welcome back to meeting 7, which will be our final meeting of the year for the Civilian Review Board work group. Thanks for everybody for coming back, and good to see all of you again. Today's meeting will likely be shorter. Our real intent today is really just to recap the recommendations that are being handed off to the administration for further refinement. We want to review where we are in the areas we've been talking about in the last several months, and then we'll talk a little bit about next steps toward the end of the meeting. So that'll be the majority of our conversation today, mostly presentation of where we are. If there are questions, certainly along the way, we're happy to entertain those, and then we'll let Matt talk a little bit about where the mayor and his team will take these recommendations from the work group moving forward. So that'll be our ongoing agenda for today. Just a reminder, as I always do, that we are in a public meeting, and so we're going to keep all the comments in the forefront, make sure that you say them orally versus using the chat feature, as we want to make sure they are all on record, and we are deliberating as a public body today and subject therein to the Open Meetings Act. So I wanted to remind all of you of that fact, which I'm sure you know pretty well by now. So I'm going to jump right in. You received a summary document in Word prior to the meeting of the recommendations coming off of the last meeting. We had a good discussion around several aspects, knowing that there's going to continue to need to be a refinement of a lot of the details of this work beyond today. And so that is where this group kind of stops their work today, allows the administration to do some of that work, as well as the legislative process to pick up. A lot of this has to be put into statute, and so that will pick up after the first of the year. And so there are still a number of details that are unsettled, and they will be unsettled after today as well, but that was also our intent. The work group was asked to set the broad framework around the powers of the group and how you saw it operating, and so I'm going to recap where I believe we are today on those various items. The other thing I'll say is, at the outset is we know there's not necessarily consensus on every point here, and that is okay. What I will share with you is the recommendations that will move forward today. You all are well aware that many of the powers and duties of the Civilian Review Board will need to be negotiated or a part of the negotiation process, and so we know that work will be ongoing, and so that power that will be sought by the group may be incremental in terms of how it comes into being. So I do want to make that caveat as well as we move into the recommendations this afternoon.
Hey,
so
Mo, does that mean that just after today, this group is disbanding?
Matt's going to talk about that at the end. I think what I'll say, Ken, is that I don't think disbanding, but there will probably be a lull in terms of actual meetings. I think we're at the place now where a lot of the questions you will have will require folks on the mayor's team to put some meat on the bones and really kind of speak to some of those questions. But I think, not to steal Matt's thunder later, but I think the intent is to bring you all back together to update you at the point of implementation. So that's my working assumption at this point, but I'll let Matt come back to that in our next steps conversation, if that's okay. So here's where we pick up today in terms of what the current framework looks like. In terms of roles and responsibilities of the CRB, we know there were 4 major responsibilities that we've seen across the country, and you all have deliberated and had a good amount of discussion about all 4 of those. We actually talked about these in depth as well as our last meeting. We know that the group is asking for the CRB to be involved in investigations and that eventually the Civilian Review Board would conduct some of its own investigations, particularly with a focus on those that deal with use of force, as well as misconduct that is discriminatory in nature among members of the law enforcement community in Columbus. In addition to investigative powers, which are pretty broad, the group would play a role through the Inspector General function to review the fairness of internal investigations in the department, and then to recommend changes to policies and procedures of those investigations. So the review function is, once those investigations have been kind of adjudicated to the department, there might be a review role that the Inspector General might play and make overall recommendations to how it is the Division of Police address things from a policy and procedure perspective. There's an adjudicative function that we talked about, and consistent with what was in the charter amendment. The Civilian Review Board will recommend discipline to the chief and the public safety director, with those individuals remaining ultimate authority. And as we talked about during our bargaining conversation, one of the things you will recall is that the current code does not allow for, and the current contract does not allow for civilians to be directly involved in terms of discipline with officers. And so at this point, they remain recommendations to those who are empowered to make those decisions, those being the chief of police and the director of public safety. And then finally, under responsibilities, there's this advisory role where the Civilian Review Board would oversee implementation of division policies and procedures and then recommend overall policy changes. And that might be looking at trend data in terms of types of complaints that are coming in. It might be particular recommendations that come out of a particular complaint or a case that gets seen by the Civilian Review Board. But one of the ongoing functions will be advisory, and that as those policy recommendations need to be made to the division and to the public safety director, those will be done, and they will continue to manage then the day-to-day operations of the department with advice and counsel coming from the Civilian Review Board. So that's a recap of our roles and responsibilities as we have talked about them thus far, and that'll be moving forward into the process. Other powers that were asked of this group include the subpoena power. What we know is the charter amendment does provide for the CRB in some instances, but it will require approval of the city attorney to request issuance of subpoenas. Additional changes in the contract we know or in state law would be required in order to have the CRB to be able to compel either attendance of a witness at a particular deliberation or the production of documents. And so there's some additional work that would have to happen for that to occur, but there are some provisions with the approval of the city attorney where the CRB can make requests for the issuance of subpoenas. One of the other functions that this group believed was important was the idea of a community outreach or liaison role for the CRB. So the idea that someone on the board staff would be charged with engaging with the community and the Division of Police on an ongoing basis, making sure there is a constant presence within the community from the CRB, and that you are actively listening to the concerns and complaints of the community that might get raised. And again, that might also lead you to additional policy recommendations or changes that the group might consider and ultimately recommend to the safety director and the chief of police. Mediation is a role that you all believe was a potential function of the group. Depending on the other powers that get codified through changes in the contract, mediation could be used through the CRB probably, and this would be for minor offenses or complaints of citizens between a resident and a police officer or someone in the law enforcement community. Playing that mediation role would be one that you believe would be something we want to explore once we have talked through the potential changes during the bargaining process. And then, of course, reporting becomes important. The idea of keeping the community abreast annually of the disposition of particular complaints, the statistics around what kinds of cases are coming before the group, how they are being dealt with, and what those final outcomes are, and then making sure that we also are disclosing any recommendations or changes the division has made to its operations, policies, or procedures. And then finally, hiring recommendations. The CRB should recommend changes to hiring and promotional practices within the division. So these are not individual cases where you're looking at the hiring or firing of an individual. These are much more universal in nature in terms of pushing the division towards certain practices or procedures relative to how it actually hires and promotes. And so the group has had some conversations about that and would, on an ongoing basis, be advising the city on opportunities to get better as it relates to hiring the very best officers and law enforcement personnel that we can. So collectively, that represents the roles and responsibilities of the group as we have discussed them and those that will be moving forward in the recommendation process. Before we move, I'll pause there if there's any questions around any of those functions. If not, we'll move into some of the composition aspects of the group.
Hey, Mo, this is Fred.
Go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. With respect to the, let me find it here. With respect to the advisory function, every time I read that provision, I come away with a different interpretation. I just want to be sure we're not saying, even though it says that um, the CRB should oversee implementation of the CPD's policies, the ultimate responsibility still rests with the safety director and not the community review board. Is that a fair statement?
I think that's a fair statement. And certainly, Alexa or Laura, if you guys want to weigh in here. But yes, as I understand it, part of that is because of the inability of us to have CRB members in a position to directly make policy, but we certainly can recommend from an overall perspective those policies to be implemented, but to be implemented by the individuals you see there, which is the safety director and the chief of police. You are correct.
Okay.
Hey Mo, it's Jasmine. Hey everybody.
Yeah.
Quick question. So we talked about the community liaison role. We had also previously talked about like having a social worker or a counselor type person. Is that rolled up into our community person as well? Because I know that we also wanted to be able to, like, somebody had a traumatic experience, we should probably connect them with counseling and or maybe some like other resources. I'm okay if that's rolled up into one person. I just would like to make note of that.
Yeah, and it is in the more detailed notes, Jasmine. I think, yes, that'd probably be the best place for it. I think what we talked about was the group, the working group after this having to think about the mechanics of how that worked, because there was either we could have a person on the CRB staff who played that role, or it could happen through contractual relationships with community-based organizations who might play that role alongside the CRB. So that's the piece that's still not fully worked out, but the note has been made that that is a function that we want to have, is to have that mental health social work component covered in how it is the CRB relates to community.
Perfect. Thank you.
And Mo, this is Fred again. And to Jasmine's point, I thought we said something along the lines that the board would have the ability to engage other personnel as deemed necessary to carry out its function. So that would give us a broad latitude with respect to those in other areas.
That's fair, and yes, that is true. The staffing model itself is still one of those open questions that will probably need to be updated to the group once those decisions are made. We have not decided yet, and Laura, you can correct me if I'm wrong in terms of how many people we're talking about, how big the staff is. I think those will be decisions that will get made here in the short term in terms of the plan, and then updated to the group as it relates to what the overall staffing structure looks like. What you all have said is these are the functions we want, and the individual roles within the department have not yet been codified yet, but that is part of the next body of work. So that is correct.
This is Laura. Mo, yeah, that would be correct. Also, it's not typical to codify in the city code the specific number of employees. It's more typical to specify what the functions of the department would be, and then, of course, it'll be determined by operational necessity, and that's something that will happen over the next number of months.
Got it.
Mo, I have two questions that are related, that have a one overarching question. Is this document we're looking at the report, or is this a summary of the report that will be written?
It is, let me ask you this way. If you think there are aspects you'd like to see in addition, then let's talk about those. I think it is a summary of the recommendations as they stand, a lot of which details are yet to be determined. And so if we had to write it today, we wouldn't know what to write, to your point, because that is the work that the administration and their internal working group have to determine. But if there are areas where we have not addressed that the group has talked about, then certainly let's talk about those now.
So I had two minor, neither of these are big points, but they are the kind of things that it would be good to have clarity about either here or in a broader report. in the very first bullet item, it says the CRB would like to be involved in investigations. I think it's useful to say in what investigations. Is this in the police department's investigations? Is this in the IG's investigations? Just to have some clarity about what investigations we're suggesting the CRB have the ability to participate in, and especially when it then suggests have the ability to conduct themselves at some point in time. So that's one. And the other was under reporting. I just thought it would be useful to indicate, are we talking about there, when it talks about the reporting activity that should take place, reporting to the public, reporting to the city council, reporting to the police chief, just something about who that reporting is to and who it's supposed to be aimed at.
Okay. Both good points. On the second one, Laura, in terms of any legislation that would come forward, would we need to specify any audiences specifically for our reporting function, or is that something we would just leave broad and put in the operational side of the policies and procedures of the department?
It's really going to be a policy call. There's no obligation to put in the city code to whom a body would report. There's already an existing provision within the city administrative code requiring departments and boards generally to do at least an annual report. So if there's a desire to codify a need to report more often, then that's something that can be done, and that's definitely something that could be considered, or it's also something that could be put in the bylaws for the commission itself, that once the commission is seated, or the board, I'm sorry, once the board is seated, they can make a determination that they would like to report out on things on a specific basis. So I think that's something that needs to be discussed, and definitely something, the feedback we would take from the advisory group as to how often that reporting should occur and what it should consist of. So
on the first point, and I'll yield to either you or Alexa for any thoughts you might have, but is that as specific as we can be around investigative function at this point, considering that we are beginning negotiations and those things? Is there any more specificity in terms of the types of investigations that we can comfortably say at this point? Or is that still an outcome of our ongoing negotiation process?
Hi, Mo. I think that we probably couldn't get too specific about the types of investigations, but what the group could say is if the recommendation is that the CRB through the IG or on its own conducts some investigations, we can put that in, and then the group could also say that they want the CRB to have some participation within the IA investigations as well. So if you would like both those powers, you could put those in, or if you just want one of them, you could put that.
Okay. So we've said, particularly around the IA piece, that would be a role of the Inspector General, and we basically say in the first one that the focus would be around use of force or officer misconduct that's discriminatory in nature. Ken, do you see other aspects that you'd like to see specifically called out in terms of the type of investigations you would want to recommend, you or anyone else within the division beyond those two?
I mean, if we are, I was thinking, maybe I'm just misremembering discussions, that we might like to be involved with IA discussions or any, I mean, I was thinking the objective here was to have this say that the CRB might at various points be involved in all kinds of different investigations. I would think the more expansively that possibility is allowed for, the better.
Yeah. In my briefing to the administration, what I did say is the group is asking for broad investigative powers, but I think to your point around the specifics that we actually call out in here, what we know is that the reality is a lot of that will have to be negotiated through, but certainly it doesn't, unless folks in the city tell me differently, it doesn't give us any heartburn to be able to strengthen that to that you're looking for the broadest possible role where the CRB would actually be able to add value. And that might be in these two type of instances like use of force, but it might also be a number of other categories of investigations where the CRB could be helpful. So we can broaden that language. If there are others on the group who believe that's the case, we certainly can take a look at that and hedge as much as possible. How about that? Any other comments, questions here? Okay. In terms of composition then of the actual civilian review board, majority of you believe that the most of the work group members, that shouldn't be work group members, that should actually be CRB members, so excuse me for that. Majority of the CRB members need to be Columbus residents, but residents outside could still join the board and are not prohibited from, but the operational procedures should identify the majority of residents within the Columbus area or Columbus MSA. Former law enforcement officers were not directly excluded from participation, but we didn't go as far as to say they are required. And so depending on how that is handled, the CRB would reserve the right to have some representative of law enforcement from a advisory capacity to always be a part of the deliberations if they so choose, but we did not recommend that there had to be a member of law enforcement on the CRB, but it does not prohibit a former member from joining if they go through the process and were duly appointed. You agreed that there should be a full background check of the CRB, any CRB appointee, not to necessarily be exclusionary. We didn't have factors that would really exclude folks, but it was important that the disclosure be there from every individual member, and so everyone would submit to a background check. Right now, the working number that I believe we have some consensus around is around 9 members. In selecting those members, you all were pretty vocal about the idea of needing to emphasize racial, ethnic, socioeconomic, gender, age, and professional skill diversity. And so we've got to be really careful in terms of making recommendations that come from the mayor and council, that all of those ranges are incorporated into the thinking of those who might be appointed. And then there was also the recommendation for 2 of those board seats to be held by community members, with the process therein and designated organizations still to be determined moving forward. In terms of appointment and selection of board members.
Sorry, Mo, I have one comment on that last section.
Go ahead.
As one of the people who advocated for inclusion of the possibility of non-residents, I also think we had a general consensus that ought to be the exception as opposed to the rule. And I had made a note on this that maybe we wanted to say that if they were going to be those from outside Columbus, they should have to either bring expertise or an unrepresented perspective with them. And unless, the only reason to go with people who are not residents is they brought specialized expertise or some other unrepresented perspective to the group.
Got it. And that is in the notes. But Laura, there was a particular phrase, I believe, that we used for some of the other commissions to kind of describe those who have, I'm going to say, an interest in Columbus but may not be residents. I think we were trying to use that standard. Do you remember what that was?
It wasn't a specific standard, but I think I gave examples where we have done something similar. For instance, in an architectural review board, where there might be an individual who is an architect who would then, that would be relevant to the board or commission. So if there's a desire to have something like that, we could craft words that would make sense for the civilian review board versus obviously architecture.
Sure. So, Ken, if I'm hearing you, then we'll make a note that the recommendation is still favoring Columbus residents, but allowing for those with specialized skills, experience, or expertise to be considered on those bases that might not be residents of the Columbus taxpayer base, but have significant value to bring to the table, is I think what I'm hearing you say.
Yeah, and I think that's making it clear that should be the exception, and there better be a good reason for the exception.
I'm with you. Okay, very good. We'll make a change there then. Any other questions around composition? All right, in terms of then board member appointment and selection. Hold on, Jasmine, I just saw something come up. What did it say? Sorry, guys, if there's a comment in the chat, I can't see it because it flashes in my screen and it leaves. So, Brandon, let me know if there's something I need to be aware of. So around board member
Hey,
appointment
Mo,
and selection. Go ahead.
Hey, Mo, sorry. It's I think Jasmine wants to make a comment, but her microphone's not working or something. Jasmine, if that's the case, just put it in the chat or text or email me and I'll make sure Mo knows about it. Thanks, Mo. Sorry.
Sure. I was just seeing if it was going to correct itself before we move. Okay, I did see her saying she'll come back on. All right, so in terms of board member appointment and selection, where we've landed is the majority around appointments made by the mayor and city council to the group, but there was a strong recommendation around the need to make sure that community organizations have a strong influence in the appointment process. And again, rules around that to be determined, but I think the general sentiment was that there had to be an opportunity for community-based organizations to have a voice in putting forth recommendations that would be strongly considered as a part of that appointment process. It was also noted that, we believe that other organizational groups should be included in the appointment process directly. We talked about that, and we've seen that in maybe a couple of cities around the country and not just the city council. So we did make note of that in the recommendations to the administration, even while moving forward the recommendations for the appointment with the mayor and council. Pause there. In terms of length of service for the group, we initially had kicked around the idea of allowing individuals to serve an initial board term. After further discussion, we decided that was not a need, and so any members who would be appointed at the beginning in 2021 would begin their full term, and those terms would be staggered to allow for turnover and not losing of institutional memory once the group is established. And so as a part of the appointment process, folks would be appointed to a staggered number of terms or staggered number of years of the term in the first case, so that there is that diversity in terms of when folks will rotate off. Initial board members still may serve 2 consecutive terms, each of 3 years each, and those term lengths should also be staggered. So again, the idea is that you don't have the board completely turning over at any one time, and so we will start the process of appointment that way in order so that, and members do not have to serve 2 terms, but are eligible to serve 2 consecutive. We did not speak to if a person can have a cooling off period and then come back later, and so that is still a possibility if a person so choose and were reappointed at another time. We've said that once a member is seated, in order to be removed, there can be a number of instances where it happens, but among those would be neglect of duty or failure to attend an appropriate number of meetings, any type of malfeasance or failure to disclose a conflict of interest that the member might have, things like failure to complete mandatory training the board might be asked to complete, a criminal conviction, or circumstances that the board deems necessary. And so it is not that these things would be automatic grounds for removal, but they would be among the things that could be considered if the CRB voted to remove one of its own members, and that would be an action of the CRB for the CRB. And then we spoke to the minimum number of meetings annually should be 4, obviously with the option to meet as often as needed, and with the expectation that in the initial year or so there probably will be more meetings as the group comes together and does some of the formation work that we know is ahead of us. Questions on board terms or length of service?
Mo, this is Fred again. With respect to, we say initial board members, are we talking about the initial members? Are we talking about the members who are appointed for the very first time this committee is established? Or are we talking about individuals who may be subsequently appointed?
In this language, Fred, we are talking about those who would be appointed in the initial 2021 class of, so the beginning board members of the CRB is, when we say initial here, we're talking about folks who would be appointed in 2021.
So those who may be appointed sometime down the line, they may or may not have a 3-year term.
they would have a maximum 3-year term. But yes, that is true. They may not have a 3-year term. And this is an area I think we've got. I think the idea was that the terms are all 3 years is what I believe we have in the notes. It's just that the staggering. Everybody in the initial, there could be some 2-year terms and there might be some 3-year terms in the 2021 class. But beyond that period, everybody would still be serving a 3-year term once their initial 2 or 3-year term is completed.
Okay, that wasn't clear to me. Okay.
That makes sense. Okay.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, cool. I'll save my other questions for the end. For this one, it says the minimum number of meetings annually shall be 4. Does anybody have a frame of reference for like how often the other groups meet? Because 4 seems really low to me. But I don't know if that's like normal.
Yeah, I think when we talked about it, Jasmine, the ongoing expectation was that the group would probably meet much more frequently than that. And part of it was about if this were to get legislated, not kind of jamming themselves up with the requirement that you meet, but always having the option to meet. So I think and Alexa, if you have specific numbers around what the average is, I think most folks are probably meeting around monthly, I believe is what I remember hearing. And so I think the expectation is that would be more meetings, but the minimum number would just be 4. And so we talked about it as a floor, but certainly not a ceiling. Alexa, any additional comments around that?
Well, you're right that a lot of groups, a lot of boards will meet monthly, but there really is a wide range and some will meet less often. So it just depends on what you all want.
Cool. And just one last quick thing. The report that's going to be sent to the mayor's office, is this also going to be made public?
I think by virtue of it being put together, Kate, Matt, it's going to be public in that way. Is that a fair statement?
Absolutely. After it's absorbed by the mayor, it's going to be a public record. So yes.
Awesome. Cool. Thank you.
Sure. We'll move now to talk about the companion role, which is the Office of the Inspector General, who works alongside the CRB with particular investigations. One of the things we talked about was the need to codify the job qualifications. And so it was listed in the conversation was that obviously the person should have significant investigative experience and background. We didn't go as far as to naming any individual background requirements beyond that. And so it would still remain up to the CRB to evaluate candidates who broadly meet the qualifications that'll be in statute and still have some flexibility to hire the right representative for the community in that role. Part of the minimum qualifications of that role would be embedded in the statute, but the further details would be made by the CRB. So basically what that means is when the legislation is put before council next year, there would be the minimum qualifications for the role would be something that is in city statute, but it still would allow for the actual application and flexibility in the determination of what person or what kinds of individuals would meet those qualifications, similar to how we have some other roles within the city that have broad qualifications in the statute, but don't get down into the details. That would be a function of the job description or other functions that the CRB would design in hiring that individual. We talked about the role should have a term of office, but can obviously be terminated for certain causes, which again, it will be something that we needed to actually codify in the next several months, and then that the term of office should not be less than 5 years. And part of that was to ensure there is a good amount of institutional memory. Obviously, if there were a challenge or a problem, the CRB reserves the right to be able to replace that person earlier. So it's not a guaranteed 5 years, but it would be for a term at least 5 years if everything is good and if that person is performing at the level the CRB believes that they should be. Questions around the Inspector General job qualifications?
I don't think this is an issue, but the phrasing, it should be no less than 5 years, suggests it could be more. I would start to get real nervous if, we had a 10-year term for this person or something like that.
You said you would get nervous, meaning you favor a shorter duration. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, I would want, something that didn't create a czar.
I'm with Ken on this one. I think maximum 5 years actually, but yeah, I understand the idea here, no less than 5 years, but more than that I think is problematic. I think 5 years is a pretty long term in of itself. Maybe you say no less than 4 years, no more than 5 years, whatever it might be. But let's say you have somebody who's not very good at their job. Then the question comes down to what termination looks like, and because that's going to be further detailed out with the CRB. You could run into some problems there that undermine the entire process. So I just worry that you got somebody in there for 5 years or more, honestly, is really more my concern. But that's kind of where I'm at.
Laura, are there any instances where city either code or just operations put a maximum number in terms of service, or just the minimum number in most cases?
Yes. In most cases, that is not the case, but there are certain circumstances where that is the case. Most notably, the chief of police and the chief of fire both serve 5-year terms that can be re-upped one additional term. The reason behind having a specific term of office is that, of course, it allows for that individual to have a certain level of independence so that they can't be removed for political reasons, either by the administration or by the board, so that they have some level of that independence. But they would still be subject to removal for cause, and it would be the same kinds of cause for the Inspector General that we had already listed out for the CRB. So malfeasance, as an example, a neglect of duty. Generally they're not doing their job or not performing their job function, would still be a reason that they could be removed.
Okay. So I've heard a couple comments, and I don't want to leave too quick. Go ahead.
So if we're talking, I think the 5 years is kind of a good balance on that, to make sure that you've got someone with independence, but that you do have, review where they would be renewed. If we were to move that lower, that term is less than that, I think it's really important that they are able to be renewed, because I think this is a kind of a technical job that's going to require a lot of expertise, and the experience that's built will be important along the way. And I don't think you want to be in a position where you're replacing this kind of director of an agency every 3 years. So I think the board should have that authority to do that.
So I've heard a couple of comments around, not wanting the person to serve too long. And so is that something that you want to see an additional recommendation around, or is it more of a cautionary point that because again, this would be the function of the CRB itself to determine if that person is doing a good job at the time and if they would renew that contract for an additional 5-year term. But are you suggesting at this point that there be something as a part of the recommendations that are moving forward that would limit that term in any way? Or are we going to trust the CRB to make that decision in real time?
Well, I think this is Fred again. I think there's an obvious concern with having too short of a term because there's a certain level of expertise that is developed in the course of that process that I think will certainly be advantageous. And if you recycle too soon, then you're going to have a lot of that time initially spent just getting familiar with the job and the various tasks that will be required. So I think having a renewable term, beginning with, whether it be 4 or 5 or 3, I think that's the subject of debate, but it should not be a term limit perspective. That would be my concern.
Okay.
And my initial point was it shouldn't be 10, because it's worded as no less than 5.
Right.
Yeah, I think you should put a cap on that.
Oh, I like the idea of the max of 5 years. Like, I agree that, like, we want someone to be in there and be consistent, but I don't think you should. Maybe we can have a renewable term, but the 5 years.
Jasmine, I'm having trouble hearing you.
Oh, I'm sorry. I agree with Kyle's 5-year cap, like, no more than 5 years. I like that language.
So if I'm hearing the conversation, it sounds like we believe the 5 years makes sense for the minimum initial term, but we might think about a period up to 5 years for any renewal term. So the board could extend a 2-year contract, not a 5-year contract the second time around. Is that what I'm hearing? So we like the idea of having the minimum to institutional memory, political issues, those kind of things. But once you get to the 5-year point, the board can exercise discretion up to 5 years, but it sounds like some of you are advocating for something that would be less than, so maybe a 2 or 3 year contract renewal. I just want to make sure I'm understanding, or do you like the idea of leaving it open?
I liked what you said, to do the 5 years and then have the terms of renewal be possibly 2 or 3 years.
So smaller renewal terms.
I would prefer a consistent. So if we wanted to do something more like 4, I would be comfortable with that. But I think it should be a consistent term for that kind of that political independence sort of reasoning.
Every time, you know. Okay. Laura, for the sake of discussion, is there a way to do the smaller terms? Like, to say the renewal would be for a different term than the initial appointment? Is that possible?
Could you do it? Yes.
Okay. We just don't typically, right?
We don't typically. Yeah. I mean, you could write something if you wanted to do it that way and say that the initial term shall be 5 years, subject to renewal up to 5 years of a subsequent term. You could write it that way. The question is whether or not that's desirable, but yeah, legally you could do it.
Okay.
I mean, yeah, we could, say a max, or I mean, honestly, you could say a 5-year term, 4 or 5 year term, right? I think we've been general enough in these recommendations that we could say IG term should be no more than 5 years, and kind of leaving it up there. I do think you should have somebody in at least for maybe 4 years, if that's where people want to be between 4 and 5 years. More than 5, I think, is too much. And then if the appointing body decides that they want to re-up for another 5 years, that's on them. But I do think we should at least cap it at 5-year terms.
Okay.
Agreed.
All right.
I'll just
make that change.
I'm sorry, Mo.
No, go ahead.
I was going to say, the reason that you see 5-year terms for things like this is because the standard period of office for municipal offices is 4-year terms. So therefore, the idea is that turnover would happen. It wouldn't always be the same administration that would be making that decision if you made it overlap by years from 5 to 4. And the Inspector General at the state level also has a staggered term that is off of the term of the governor for that same reason.
Got it. Okay. All right, so we'll make the changes to modify this, it sounds like, with the flexibility of up to 5 years, which would give subsequent CRBs the ability to exercise in maybe the full 5 in more rare instances, but perhaps in the renewal, be able to exercise smaller increments if they think it is necessary. So I think that would satisfy. I believe what we're hearing is that we believe once we get past 5 years, there's some differences in terms of how long we believe the person ought to be able to serve.
So, sorry, just to make sure I understand, we're now going to say we recommend a term of 5 years, renewable for up to an additional 5 years. Is that what you're suggesting?
I think my suggestion was, I think the flexibility, it might be better if we made the initial term to be, instead of not less than, I think is what I heard, is up to 5 years, and that means that any term could technically be shorter, but in the contracting with the person, there probably is a bias toward at least 5 years on every term. Is how I was interpreting that. Now, we can do the renewal option. To Laura's point, she said it was possible. So those are kind of your two options. The whole term being up to 5 years with discretion of the CRB, or an initial term of 5 years plus a smaller quantity in the renewal term. Those are kind of your two options, I believe I've heard.
But if we're recommending the length of the, we're making recommendations, and I guess I heard it as we would recommend that, council or the initial review board sets the terms, and they could pick a time frame that would be up to 5 years, but they couldn't pick a 6-year term to set the terms for the IG, and then it would consistently roll at that interval, whatever that is, possibly with the option to re-up for multiple terms.
Yeah, I would add into that, Aaron, because my understanding would be, or my thought would be, I mean, it's a max 5-year term, right? And if they were to be re-upped, it would also be a 5-year term. That's where I'm thinking. The reason being for that is if you don't have consistency, then what happens then is after you hit that 5-year mark, there's a decision that could be made to say, do we renew this person for maybe up to 5 years, but not the full 5 years, maybe a couple years, whatever the line is, which could then disqualify other potential eligible inspector generals, because there's going to be a tendency to say, well, let's go to this one because we're only going to do a few years because it's re-upping. I think we just, keep it consistent as far as the terms go. So max 5 years. And whatever, is decided, that's the terms, whether you're re-upped or not.
Are we comfortable with that? So the provisions would be, again, up to 5 years, but the length of those terms would remain consistent unless, again, the CRB would have the ability to not renew a contract for that longer term if they so chose. But the idea would be that the terms would be up to 5 years and not necessarily a minimum of 5 years, if I'm hearing the conversation correctly. Any objections to that?
I have this, Fred, again. Consistent with Laura's comments. That calls for, invites a certain level of inconsistency as well as uncertainty. I think there should be a definite term. Now, whether it's subject to renewal, I think is another debate. But certainly, if you have a definite term that straddles an administration, that removes the political element of it, or at least modifies it somewhat, so that a new administration coming in doesn't just say, I'm going to kick this person out.
Got it. So if we left it as it currently exists, we don't need to do anything. It just means that, again, a term not less than 5 years means that it could end up being 7 or 8. It doesn't have to be 10. So we have not said that any renewal term has to be for an additional 5 years. So if I'm understanding this, if we just kept it at, and Laura, you correct me if I'm wrong, if we kept it at the terms being no less than 5 years, which I don't believe anybody was opposed to that. I think the question became if we liked the people serving longer than 5 years, right? So if we kept it at no less than 5 years and didn't speak to renewal at all, what that would mean is at the 5-year mark, the CRB has to make a decision about if that person gets a new contract for 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5 years. Would that settle it?
Could you
No,
say
not
no
quite.
less than 5 years? Could you say no less than 5 years and no more than 10?
No. How about this? How about we say IG terms should be a max of 5 years or 5 years? Because I think that might get it. Because the issue was no less than 5 years. We don't want a 10-year term, right? We want to put a cap. And I think there is general agreement that we cap it at 5 years as a max, not even talking about renewal.
So, Mo?
So I don't know that I heard the consensus around the no more than 5 years. I did hear we like 5 years for this. So I think what we're talking about is the initial time, the appointment versus how long the person would serve in totality, right? So I guess the first question I'd ask you to respond to is there anyone who believes that the first time an IG is appointed, the term should be less than 5 years?
No, but we also don't think it should be much more.
Yeah.
Right. That's where the gray area
with the
comes in,
language
right?
that's in there.
I would just say no more than 5 years, or maybe just 5 years. Can we a 5-year term?
5 years.
I agree. No one should be there for a decade. It's too much.
Hey, now I've been here for a decade now.
Give us some language.
Can I suggest some language that the term is for 5 years and that it is renewable?
That's beautiful. That sounds perfect.
Nice and simple.
All right. The ID term should be 5 years with the option of renewal. Is that fair? We can live with that?
So much easier to write, though.
All right, fair enough. Thanks, Kent. I needed that. I appreciate it. Okay. Any other? So we're going to talk about next steps in terms of where all this goes from here. I'll turn it over to Matt in a second. But those really represent the majority of the provisions, with some kind of caveats and details we'll add into the document that will go to the administration's team for further development. And again, what we know is a lot of decisions to be made, and then the legislative process has got to pick up in terms of actually putting some of these things into statute. But any general questions, comments before we move into the next steps part of the discussion? All right. Matt, I'm going to turn it over to you. Where's his slide? To talk about next steps. Hold on. Not sure why I can't see this. Hold on.
I didn't know I had a slide. Thanks, Mo. I appreciate it. Thanks, everybody.
There you go.
Thank you. Thanks, Mo. So, there are two things really that have kind of confined this work so far from really getting started and getting the board seated and the work starting and things like that. The first one, obviously, is the approval of the charter amendment. That is obviously done. The second one was this work group to meet and deliberate and make recommendations, and to take your time and to talk about as many things as you wanted to, and have time to deliberate and hear from all the experts that you wanted to. So now that is done, we can really start getting moving. So there's a few things that will be happening from now on. The first one is having to codify all of these recommendations that you have put forth. So we'll be working with council, as the bullet says, over the next 2 months to draft ordinances on these recommendations. We'll get these to council as soon as we can. Because of the holiday schedule, some members will be out. There won't be some meetings in December, so I think it would probably look like January before we can get these to council. They'll, I'm sure, want to do public hearings on these and invite people for testimony. So that will probably be in the month of January. The next step really is to look for the right people for the board. You were very deliberate in saying who you thought the members should be. So we want to make sure we find the right people, and that is obviously very important. We know from
decided already that we weren't going to have a community group pick people. We decided that we were going to have political appointments. Did that get decided last time?
Thanks, Jasmine. We decided that would be the process. The majority, we feel, of the members agreed with that. We did note in the recommendations that we sent to you, we made sure that we pointed out that there were minority opinions on this, and we noted that those minority opinions did suggest or recommend that there would be outside organizations that did make appointments, but those were not the majority. So those were in the recommendations that were sent to you.
I will say on that front, I don't know how much minority opinion it was. I mean, I do, I think we had a general conversation about it. I don't necessarily know if the points made were of the minority. So I think that the phrasing on that is important. I think that we should think about the broader options here, because I don't know if we really kind of went at it and said, no, we're not going to do that, and there's only a few voices there. But I could be completely wrong. But I did want to make sure that we brought that up again, because again, Jasmine mentioned that as far as elections go, and then at the very least, the attempted compromise that I was trying to put forward was, even if you don't elect people directly to the board, you have other people responsible for making the appointment outside of just the mayor and city council. So that's one of those things that I do think is important, that I would at least like to throw a little bit more weight behind, knowing that it might end up being in the minority, but I do think it's worth this group to wrestle with that a little bit more without going into too much detail. That's all.
And if I could step in.
I have to hop off to go to work, to do something for work, but I will say I understand maybe the first set of people being appointed because we don't have enough time to pull this committee together. But I think moving forward, if you're asking the people to trust a process, the people shouldn't be involved in that process. And if there are appointments coming from political figures, I think that you're removing that element. And like, I get the community board, and I get that maybe the first time the mayor and city council seat these people, but I think moving forward, there needs to be an effort to come up with a way in which communities is actually involved in the selection process.
Okay. Well, thank you for your comments. We certainly appreciate that.
Matt, I think
yes.
Kate was going to touch on that.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Kate. Sorry.
Sure, Matt. No, and we've been discussing this, Kyle, to your point. We have, talked to the mayor about different iterations, and he's totally open to maybe a process like we have with the police and fire candidates, which is it's called the Coke and Foam Board, where we have interviewed civilian folks from the outside that come in and sit on these boards, and go through the interview process with the people that are seated in the police and fire classes. We've also talked about what if we have an interview panel that consists of, representatives from the council, from the mayor's office, and then some neighborhood groups to vet the people that are going to sit on the civilian review board. So we're talking about all different kinds of iterations of a panel that would interview for this. So nothing's out of the realm of possibility right now. So nothing's off the table.
That's great. No, that's perfect. That's the exact type of approach that I think makes sense, just in terms of building out community trust, credibility. I just didn't want it to make it seem like it was just kind of a discarded point that we made. And so I just wanted to add a little bit more force to that recommendation, even if it's in the minority. But I think just what you mentioned, those types of options are the approaches that I think get at some of those other harder questions about, who's the community group that you choose, and that way you can kind of rotate some of that out. So thank you for that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, thank you for that, Kate. That's helpful.
Mo, should I move on?
Yes, please, go ahead.
Okay, thank you. So we still have some work to do here. As Kate said, nothing's off the table, so we'll continue to look at this. But we still need to seek the right members of the board. And we know from the charter amendment that they have to be a diverse and representative of our community. So we need to, reach out to all corners of our city, to all communities, to make sure that everybody knows about it, has a chance to apply for this, understands the process. We know that we need to get the best and the absolute best, most diverse candidates for this position, that we can. So that we'll be reaching out, whether that's public service announcements or some type of announcements like that to make sure we communicate this as widely as possible. But we do plan to seat the board by the end of the first quarter of 2021. We have also something else just begun, the negotiations with the FOP. This will take some time. It's not a short or easy process, but we want to make sure that we work to include all of the provisions, the powers and duties that the work group members said the CRB should have. So that will be ongoing. And it's also crucial that we find the right person for the Inspector General role. We talked a lot just now about the terms that this individual should have. We feel that we should not limit ourselves and that we should do a national search, that we can find the best candidate with the best experience who would be right for this position. But we still have a goal of finding this person, hiring them within the next 6 months. And then finally, I think Kent mentioned this earlier in the meeting, is the work group disbanded at this point? We know that we would like to bring you back within 6 months and let you know where we are and the progress that we've made and hear what you have to say. You guys have done a lot of work on this. We'd like to brief you regularly, and your input still matters. So we can decide after that when we meet again in 6 months what the next steps are for this group after that. And those are the immediate next steps that we have. Thanks, Mo.
And then also, Matt, if I can add really quick, we will be also updating the dashboard that is out there currently, looking at the recommendations from our previous commission. So we will add this information so the community is aware as well of the updates.
Any questions on next steps for Matt or city folk?
I'd like to make a request. Not that we would meet or discuss it, but I think it would be useful for those of us who actually would be interested in doing so, that when there is legislation that is drafted and is pending before the council on this subject, that it be made available to the group to look at if they are inclined to do so, and who comments might be sent to if anybody's got any comments on that regard.
Duly noted. And it may not be out of the question, Matt, that work group members might be asked to participate in some of those hearings or provide any testimony, or
thanks, Mo. Yeah, I would expect that. I would expect members to call you, members of city council to reach out and either want you to testify or provide written testimony, or just to brief them on the process, how you felt the process went, and also how the recommendations were handled.
Matt, I have a question on that point. What if folks outside of this panel and outside of the city reach to individual members of this panel? How should we respond?
Was that Fred? Sorry, I did not hear you very well. It was a little.
You indicated that there might be members of council or the mayor's office who would reach out to us. What about folks from the community who might reach out to us? How should we respond? Should we direct them to you or what?
Oh, thank you, Fred. And please, Phil, you are members of this work group. It is a public group. All of our meetings are public anyway. The members are free. If you want to respond to those, if someone from the community reaches out to you, you have the opportunity to respond any way you like. However, if you don't feel comfortable doing that, or you would like someone else to weigh in, feel free to send them my way. We could certainly take care of any questions that they may have.
I'll be happy to do so.
Thank you.
I like it. All right. Any other questions as we get ready to close? All right. So you've kind of heard where the process picks up from here, building in an opportunity for you all to get an update after some of the more foundational mechanical work is done. But certainly let me say, and I'll yield to Kate for any closing comments she might have. Just thank you for your walking through the process this far. It was a great body of discussion, and just on behalf of the community, you've rendered a great service. And so I think certainly, and I had the opportunity to brief both the mayor and council president on some of our progress, and they have been just so complimentary of what you all have been able to do and bring forward. So thank you from the RAMA team and for all the folks involved, and I will turn it over to Kate and Matt for any last words on behalf of the administration.
And I would just like to thank everyone on behalf of the people in the administration for all the hard work you've put in on this. It feels like we just started this yesterday. It's been a year, but it's amazing how much work we've gotten done. I just appreciate everyone taking the time and all the brain power that we've had in this room together. If anything comes up that you think of past this, feel free to email me. Again, thank you so much. We appreciate the service. Thanks.
All right, we'll leave it there. Thanks everybody, and we look forward to updating you in the coming months. Let us know if there's questions in the interim.
Thanks everybody.